I'll just be sharing my screen. So basically, I work for a company named MetrixLab, and I'm a client director over here. MetrixLab is basically one of the fastest growing market research companies globally. And like Joanna mentioned, that I have an experience across a host of clients and a host of industries where I've not only kind of done research projects, so to say, but also kind of helped build the market research function also for a couple of companies where I was actually heading the insights function. And this is something which is really dear to me, and I've been doing it for a decade now. And hopefully, as a part of the session, as a takeaway, you will really understand on how do you make sure that your market research project is a success, and also the different ways and means in which you can kind of arrive at insights. So I hope everybody can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it. All good.
Perfect. So what we'll cover today is basically what you see on the screen here. So we'll try to first understand what does market research mean, what are the different ways in which research can be done, and we'll also try to understand how technology is kind of really evolved and how you can kind of utilize it for doing market research, or how companies have kind of utilized it for doing market research. And obviously, what is the role of market research in the overall marketing strategy and planning? Because it has to obviously fit somewhere in terms of how do companies take a decision and what stage of the marketing funnel do they take a decision at. We'll also try to understand basically, what are some of the critical success parameters for any quantitative research project, and then what is the role of statistics or even advanced analytics when it comes to understanding the consumers you want to understand better. And then followed by certain examples on how you can blend in market research in terms of telling insights to companies, or how some of those companies have kind of utilized market research for developing the marketing strategy for a specific market or a category. So my first question to all of you here is, what do you think market research means?
If anyone feels bold enough to unmute their mic, you can. It's absolutely fine. It's not a lot of people in here. But if not, you can drop your answers in the chat as well, and I will read it out. All right, so Ekta says researching for demand and supply and about the product.
Yes, absolutely.
Havra says understanding the sort of trends in the market.
Yeah.
Tina says it's a way to collect data. Georges says it's a way to gather information. From Vincent, market research is the total collection of data of the certain product.
Yeah. I'll just give it another 30 seconds. Any more?
From Catherine, it helps companies make good decisions about their product.
Yeah. All right. So all of those are absolutely valid points, and as you must have seen by the responses itself, right? You've got varied responses for everybody over here, and market research would obviously be market research is actually all of these what you say, and obviously much beyond that also. It's not just about the product; it's about understanding the category, it's about understanding the brand, and as such, it's also about understanding the culture, right? It's not just about product now. Now, say, for example, you want to launch a product in the market without understanding the culture. You either would do well, maybe if maybe it's a fluke, or you might just fall flat, right? So at the end of it, it's an amalgamation of these different things which you spoke about. At the same time, also that cultural understanding of actually how consumers behave in the market. And there's something which is really, and I would like to just basically show an example over here of one brand which is really dear to me. And I'm somebody who likes to have good food, And there's this specific product called Vada, which is a very Indian product which you get in southern part of India, which I really crave for whenever it's a weekend, and I make sure that I always order a Vada. But whenever I try to replicate, and I love to cook actually, so people who know me would definitely say that I cook well. I hope I cook well. But then vada is something which is really difficult. Vada is nothing but a donut, right? What you see as a donut, and it's something which is really difficult to replicate at home. And just the issue of having the perfect consistency, or even having that hole in the center of the donut, is something which is difficult to come. And how to, and it was always difficult for me to really get that right product every time. And there's this really excellent example of a company called ID, which is again an Indian company, which actually came up with this really amazing idea, basis the pain point which I also had, right? Like, I cannot make something which is consistently the same, and also the hassle of actually making a batter, and and just having the same consistency in terms of the product taste itself. And I'll just show you a video over here which kind of shows what this company ID really did to address that pain point which consumers really had.
This is no ordinary snack, a South Indian specialty. It's a favorite in homes across India, but its circular cylindrical shape and donut-like hole make it fairly difficult to prepare at homes. It needs the expert hands of grandmas and aunts or even restaurant cooks. Not anymore. ID decided to turn its attention on this age-old problem and transform the complex art of vada making into a science for everyone. And the key ingredient? Common sense. A path-breaking little big invention. The spout that shapes batter into vadas with the hole. And that's it. Squeeze, shape, cut, fry. Handmade, but with no mess, no stress. Just delicious, crispy vadas. ID Vada batter in a pack that shapes batter into vadas. Now, everybody can vada.
Such a very simple thing, right? So as in, the company really identified the pain point and made sure they have a product which is kind of functional. At the same time, also it's very convenient, right? And you don't have to worry about the consistency each and every time. You just have something which is ready to make. And for somebody like me who's actually always on the go, I have to go to office, and there's not really time which I have, and specifically for all of us over here, right? We are really pressed for time. So having something which is as convenient as this is something which is like which is something really remarkable, and the company really latched onto this pain point. And definitely there has to be a lot of research which has gone behind in terms of understanding what those pain points are from a consumer perspective. So in a nutshell, and I really like this line over here in very plain and simple terms, it's about any effort to gather information about markets or customers. That is what market research is. It could be to understand the market, it could be to understand who your competition would be if you want to enter into the market, or just plain simple consumer understanding in terms of what are the different behaviors, or trying to understand their culture to really make a decision around how do you basically target these people. And and market research is something which you actually do on an everyday basis. Say for example, you're going to buy a car, right? So what are the steps you would typically take to decide on which car to buy, right? So you would typically go through this phase, right? So there would be a need why you want to buy a car, and the need could be basically because you got a new driver's license and you want to just go and buy a car, or it could be that you have a car which is junked and you want to buy a new car, or you want to upgrade from a basic model to a more luxury model. So there could be different needs, and for those different needs, then you would have different triggers and different touch points, basically basis which you would kind of be able to address a specific need. And once you really decided on that you want to go and buy a car, you start looking at information across different sources. You would talk to your friends, you would look up online, you would look at Facebook, you would look at different social media platforms for that matter, and really understand which brand you want to buy or which model you want to buy. And then eventually you would go on the shop floor, you would do a test drive, you would try to figure out whether it really is good at handling, etc. And then you would ultimately make a purchase decision, right? And there are multiple factors which would trigger or hinder you buying a specific brand or a variant. It could be to do with the cost, it could be to do with the handling, it could be to do with anything else which is important for you to make a purchase decision on. And post buying, obviously, so research doesn't end there, right? So at the end of it, once you buy the product, then you would use it. In case you're like happy with the experience, you would share your experience with others. You would probably go online and talk about how great experience you've had. Or for that matter, in case you had to service your car, then you would definitely look for support and you will try to see what the experience has been over there. And then if everything is good, then you would possibly repurchase it whenever there is a need for you to buy a car again. And this purchase cycle, so to say, is very different for across people, right? And it's the role of a market researcher to really unravel what those journeys are for different consumers. And this purchase journey would be really different across different categories, right? Now, say for example, you have to go and buy a chocolate. So in case of a chocolate, more often than not, you're already decided. So what could possibly be the need for a chocolate, right? Either you want to satisfy a craving, or it could be something else. And you possibly already have a brand in mind that you always want to consume. So that research phase kind of goes out, and you would just go forward and buy. But at the end of it, if the product is not available, then you would want to understand basically, would you switch or would you not switch? And obviously, after you try the product, then if the experience of trying the product is kind of satisfying, you would kind of repurchase it again. So this purchase cycle differs for different categories, but then the crux of the matter is that at the end of it, research is about understanding how these journeys are different for different consumers. And this is just one thing which you can kind of understand as a part of research, and this is what you see on the screen over here. And if you look at market research, the industry is no small, right? If you see the kind of spends which companies are doing on market research, it was 72 billion approximately in 2020, and it's only poised to grow. So it's expected to be 75 billion. Obviously, as a result of COVID and everything, companies have reduced in terms of expenditures. But then if you look at the average spend across the years, it's definitely going to grow, and market research would be very critical for companies going forward. And hence, all the more critical for us to really understand, different ways in which you can do research, and what are the critical success factors in terms of making research successful for the company that we kind of do research for. And if I were to classify basically what are the different ways of doing market research, there could be two ways, right? Either they are survey based, and that would be a bit of a focus today, but then there are also non-survey based methods in terms of doing research, right? And we'll just quickly look at basically what those things are. So survey-based research could be using structured surveys such as your surveys. You must have definitely received a lot of surveys when you go to shop, or when you're banking with a specific bank. You'll receive surveys around how satisfied you are with the experience, or with the ease of finding a specific product in store. And those are more of your quantitative surveys, wherein you have a structure in place, you have a scaled question, and there is a definite answer to basically what you're trying to understand. And unstructured surveys are something which is more qualitative or exploratory in nature, wherein you just as and when you proceed with the discussion with the consumers, you kind of mend your ways in terms of how do you ask the questions to really get to the depth of why consumers are saying or doing certain things that they're doing. And when it comes to a non-survey based method, and this is something which has evolved considerably over the years, definitely your company annual reports, your trade journals, government reports are some of the ways in which you can use non-survey based research, which is nothing but called as secondary research also. So survey based research is more of called as primary research, and non-survey based is more of secondary research. But then you've got social media, which is also kind of really picking up, wherein brands want to really understand what is the sentiment of consumers, or what sentiment of people who are following me on my brand page. And a very good example of companies who actually use social media research really well is JetBlue Airlines, who actually use social media to their advantage to an extent that they respond to consumers within a span of, I think, 24 hours, if I'm not wrong. So they're really prompt, and they use social media to really engage with consumers in a very powerful way. Passive metering is something which is, say, for example, if I were to ask you what all did you browse on your phone yesterday, recollection is something which becomes really difficult for consumers, specifically when there are things which happen very frequently, right? So passive metering is a means of basically collecting information without consumers knowing that you're collecting information. And for those in UAE, off late you might have noticed that when you're trying to install certain apps, they always ask you, would you like the app to track what you're doing or not? And that is basically passive metering, where they try to understand basically what you are browsing, what you're looking at, what web pages, for how long are you staying on it, what apps you're using. And this way you can really capture the what's around what people are doing. But then obviously, you need to understand the whys. And I'll come to that in a bit. Similarly, say for example, videos are really powerful non-survey based methods wherein, say for example, you really want to understand how do people use, say, dishwashing liquids. And you really want to understand, what do they use along with the dishwashing liquids. So they might use a scrub, they might use, say, another powder, or there are different ways in which different consumers use different products. And videos are a good way of actually understanding what people do and what people do not even realize they're doing, right? Because it's something which is very autopilot, where people are just used to doing the things the way they do. And it's a good way of understanding basically how people are using something in a more passive way, so to say. And then you've got brainwave mapping, wherein you try to understand, say for example, you want to understand if there is a specific ad, does it really intrigue people or does it really interest people? Then you have brainwave mapping, which can tell basically whether a creative or an ad kind of piques interest of consumers. And then you've got more of machine learning and AI kind of studies or AI kind of work, which you can actually kind of utilize to basically understand which packs would do in the market, for that matter, or for example, if advertising would really click through in the market or not. But having said that, while you've got so many ways of doing research, but all of these do not sit in isolation. So while structured survey, and that's more of a discussion for today, structured surveys or quantitative surveys, try to really understand some of those nuances around how consumers behave or what consumers do and why. But obviously, you would need to use a mix of these different survey and non-survey based approaches to be able to answer the questions. So for example, I spoke about passive metering, right? So people use apps, but you really want to understand. So passive metering will be able to understand basically how people are behaving, what are they using, for how long, etc. But if you really want to understand why they're doing so and for what reason or for what occasion. So for example, say I ordered something, I ordered food yesterday for, say, some of my guests. But what passive metering will do is it'll just capture that I've ordered something or I've interacted with something. But what a structured survey will help you to get at is basically understanding what did people do exactly? Did they order for guests, and why did they order a specific thing or not? So both of these things need to go hand in hand, and that's where the beauty of the researcher lies, wherein you use a mix of methods to really understand what the consumer is doing and why. And there's like I said, there's no one size fits all approach for doing a research. The technologies and techniques that are used to do market research have evolved over the years, like we saw in the previous slide. But then the ways of understanding the consumer, the competitors, or the category itself are the same. The basics are the same, and there's no shortcut to understanding it. At the end of it, technology is just a means of achieving the end goal, but it's not the end, right? The technology can just aid you in understanding, but at the end of it, you have to use a mix of these methods to really understand the core of what a consumer is. And research is nothing but like peeling an onion, if I would say that way. It's about understanding the depth of consumers or the customers. Why do they make certain decisions? And ultimately, if you want to do research, you would need to step into the shoes of a consumer to understand, how they feel or behave. And I would rather ask, or I would rather urge you, each of you, to kind of possibly do one thing wherein say you want to understand why consumers say shop for cereals as a category. So what you could, and this I've done quite a bit when it comes to research. So what I do is typically I try to even go and I just stand next to a shelf. Say I want to understand how consumers shop for cereals in the industry, in the market. So I would just go and stand next to the cereals aisle in a supermarket or a hypermarket, and I would just observe what people do. And that itself is really insightful in terms of understanding, how people make decisions. Do they purchase? Do they just, come in and pick the pack they want, or they, kind of browse through? They look at different packs, or they look for the information on the pack to really understand basically, what the product is about and what are the ingredients. So just that little bit of effort from your end also would really help you understand basically how consumers typically make a decision in your market. And at the end of it, research is about understanding. What you see on the slide is something which Daniel Kahneman has written in his book called Thinking Fast and Slow. At the end of it, majority of consumer decisions happen through system one thinking, which is nothing but your intuitive part of the brain. An intuitive part of the brain is nothing but subconscious, where you make decisions without rationalizing anything. So, for example, if I were to go and buy a chocolate, I would say I want to buy a dairy milk, and irrespective, right? So I would just say, yeah, if it's a chocolate, it's dairy milk. And 95% of decisions actually happen using system one thinking. So it's and it's up to and it's up to us to really make sure that we are able to tap into that system one kind of a thinking. And research has kind of really evolved to really understand the system one part of the brain. And obviously, system one part of the brain is one thing to understand, but at the same time also you would also want to understand the system two part of the brain, wherein you would want to understand how often do people shop for a certain category, or certain behaviors, which is more of rational or logical, so to say. And I would just kind of share some examples over here. Say, for example, there's a company which is into the beauty category, and beauty category could encompass a whole lot of things, right? So say there's a company who wants to enter a new market. They already have existing range of products across different categories within beauty, but they want to enter a new market, and they want to really understand basically how do they enter the market, right? So, and this is just an approach, but this is not something which is cast in stone. Obviously, it really depends on what sort of information the company has already with them. But if you want to enter the market, you definitely want to understand at the bottom over here the consumers themselves, right? So you want to understand the cultural and the emergent dynamics in the market. This could be basis, certain data sources that you already have, or you would rather want to do a qualitative understanding of basically those consumer habits, the cultural understanding, and also probably quantify some of those themes which are emerging from the qualitative. Followed by, you would want to, once you understood the construct of the consumers in the market itself, then you would kind of start understanding from a category perspective, basically what are the consumer regimes. So in case of beauty category, you would want to understand basically what are the regimes with respect to beauty, how often do they use, why do they use, what do they use, what are the different needs which kind of make certain products relevant. And then you would want to understand basically, what are the different brands which are operating in the market, what are the different purchase dynamics. Once you've identified that, then you will try to really prioritize basis how big the categories are in the market and how often do consumers use, to really understand, what are the development cues for you in terms of the category in the market. And once you've identified all of these in terms of the cultural understanding, in terms of understanding what are the big need states, in terms of understanding, what are the big opportunities, you would then map the client or the company offering to these consumer needs to really understand where to focus your efforts towards. Because obviously, you cannot do everything all together at once, right? You would rather need to prioritize where you need to go forward and invest your energies into. And this is where research really helps you really understand this. Yeah. And I spoke about the system one and system two approaches, right? Now imagine this, that you want to really understand how do consumers shop for a certain category. And this is an example from a chocolate category. And we at MetrixLab also kind of use a lot of these system one and system two techniques to really be able to capture how consumers behave with respect to certain categories. So if you look over here, if I were to ask you what did you shop for, or what brands you would typically shop for, you would typically say your usual brands, right? You would say, I shop for Cadbury, I shop for this, I shop for that. But then once you ask people to kind of, get into a scenario where you tell them, imagine that you're walking into a supermarket and you were to shop for chocolates. Now this is an aisle in front of you, and I would want to really, browse like you typically do in a supermarket, and and pick the brands you want to choose in the next 3 months, for example, right? And you're not using a survey-based approach over here. What you're asking the respondents to do is basically browse like they would normally do. At the back end, you have the data being captured automatically with respect to how much time they're spending on the shelf, how much time they're taking to find a specific product, or what pack or what product do they pick out from the shelf, which is again, very system one led, right? You're asking people to not state something, you're rather asking people to do something, which is more realistic, right, in terms of understanding how people typically shop. And this approach is not just developed for the sake of it, right? At the end of it, at MetrixLab, we kind of really strongly correlated this with the actual market performance of products. And these kind of techniques really closely mimic how consumers really shop in the market as well. And it's reflective of the future market share also of different products. So this is one of the examples of how you can really tap into the system one, wherein you're using a more of a non-obtrusive way of understanding how consumers typically shop. And there are different ways of capturing different kind of information that you want to understand from a research perspective. And and market research is very vital, right? More than ever. Now, this is a very and I really like this part over here on the right, which was actually built by Mark Risson in his book called The Proper Marketing Club, where you typically see marketers today, saying that I have a brilliant product and I want to launch in the market and let's promote this product to get as much sales as possible. But then proper marketers, if you see, they always start with understanding what the market is. They try to really understand what that opportunity is in the market. Who are the people I need to target? How do I need to target? With what I need to target? And then eventually you really define on your positioning, etc., and be able to develop a product which is kind of winning for the market. And if you look at it 2 years back or 2 years post COVID, right, it's become all the more important. With COVID, there has been acceleration of certain habits. Say, for example, people have started going out less in certain markets, and they're still continuing to going out less. People are buying more online for that matter. So these habits are kind of and these habits are not just at a point in time. These habits are kind of continuing post COVID also in certain markets. So it becomes very critical for marketers to really understand, go back to the drawing board and really understand, what this change has meant for the consumers, how it's impacted the attitudes and behaviors towards certain categories. And hence, research becomes very critical for understanding, how that landscape has kind of transformed for the marketers. And research could, and quantitative market research as such could fit anywhere in each of these buckets, right? It could fit into innovation strategy for a company, it could fit into the brand strategy of a company, it could fit into the customer strategy of the company. So quantitative market research, when it comes to developing an innovation strategy, we spoke about understanding what are those spaces wherein I can enter, where we saw the example of a marketing strategy wherein you want to understand the market, explore basically what are the consumer needs, and then really identify what is that fit for you to actually really target against. At the same time, also what market research can help you understand is, is the product good enough or not? So once you've actually kind of developed a product, you test it among consumers and really try to understand whether it's good enough or not. And if you want to kind of really modify the offering, depending on what the consumer responses are. Say, for example, you launch a juice in the market, you want to launch a juice in the market, and you really want to understand the product and different parameters around taste, around bitterness, around sweetness, around sugar, etc. Market research can really help you understand basically, what is the pain point with respect to the product and how you can kind of modify it. Or for that matter, you want to really launch a product in the market and you want to understand, how do you make sure your product is kind of visible on the shelf, or you're able to make sure that there are enough offtake for your brand from the shelf. Then you can definitely do a sales activation exercise where you really understand what really will make a brand pick up from the shelf. And this is more from the innovation side of it, but from a brand point of it, obviously, while you might buy a brand while you might buy a product, but obviously there is something which is more, you feel bonded to a specific product as well, right? So how do you measure that bond which you have with the product? And that is where, you really try to understand, what is the kind of brand equity that your brand has among the consumers. Because brand equity is something which is more of subconscious, which is not something which can be measured. And being able to measure that sort of an equity which consumer has, that is always something which market research can help brand understand. Or for that matter, you want to launch an ad in the market. So what market research can help you understand is basically right from the stage of, just the, when you have the idea itself to the point of after the campaign has been launched in the market, it can help you understand how you can refine the campaign going forward so that people feel connected to your brand and obviously as a result buy your brand more often. It can also help you understand basically how effective are different media in building your brand going forward. So obviously you might have seen that you have different campaigns which launch in the market which straddle across TV, online, online also you see it across say Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, etc. So what market research can help companies understand is basically what are the synergies between different media that can help you achieve your brand goal. And customer strategy, at the end of it, it's about understanding basically do people have a good experience with your brand? Are they satisfied? Or for that matter, even if you want to understand your employees, right? This is more from a B2B perspective, wherein you want to understand, are your employees satisfied? And you must have, and for those of you who are working currently, you might have seen these surveys which come from your HR when they want to understand how satisfied you are with your experience while at the company, and if there is anything that they can do to improve your experience, right? And you have a set of questions which are asked. So at the end of it, this market research can actually kind of fit in each of these places. And all of these again do not live in isolation, right? Now think of it this way: that if you want to, if there's a company who wants to enter new in the market, or new in the category, or target a new consumer segment, the research could actually straddle across all of these three things. So take an example of a company who plans to launch a new innovation in the market. So you would definitely have a host of ideas which the company has that they want to screen and understand basically which of these ideas are the most promising for them to launch. So you do market research, you identify basically, say these are the set of 2 or 3 ideas out of the 10 ideas that you want to launch. You develop a prototype for them. Once you develop a prototype for them, you test it in the market to see whether that product would do well in the market or not from a consumer standpoint, understand what are the optimization ideas. Then once you develop the product, you try to understand what is the optimal launch strategy for the product. And once the product has been in the market for a very long time, for a considerable amount of time, you would want to understand basically what is the kind of equity that product has in the market. And obviously that equity would be supported by a lot of campaigns or promotions, etc. So you would want to really understand whether those campaigns have had an impact on that brand or not. So research can actually straddle across all of these. It's more of a continuous learning process for us as researchers as well as marketers as well, wherein you keep on you keep on going through the cycle of understanding consumers for different products across different stages. And when it comes to market research or quantitative research as such, there are 6 critical factors which are really important for any market research or quantitative research. One is the context, and I'll come to that in a bit. So context about how narrow or broad you want to understand the category, and I'll give you some certain examples in the following slides around what do I mean by context. The category itself is also very important, right? So how dynamic is the category? And this would definitely define on who do you want to target or when do you want to survey. Now, take for example, you want to understand, say, something with respect to, say, soft drinks as a category. So would you actually want to do a survey during the winter time? Obviously not, right? So you need to really have an understanding of the category, of the market, to be able to, very firmly take a decision on, how to go about with doing that specific market research. The sample size, and this is very critical, specifically for quantitative research, because quantitative research deals with big sample sizes. It's not just 1 or 2 people, it's talking about hundreds and thousands of people at a time. So depending on the research objective, obviously you need to ensure that you have enough sample size to be able to, take a firm decision as to what needs to be done, or whether it's a go or a no-go in case of a product launch. The methodology itself is very critical, right? So in terms of methodology, when it comes to market research, there are different ways of collecting the data. So you've got these host of online panel companies who basically have people who are empaneled, who take market research surveys on a continuous basis. So either you reach out to them online, and it's all the more valid in today's scenario where you're not able to meet people face to face in some of the markets. So online research would become more important in those markets where you're able to reach people through their device and not through face to face. Offline methodology is where certain markets where, say for example, online penetration is not so high, and say for example certain say low internet penetrated markets where you want to really understand consumers itself. So you would definitely want to do a face-to-face research where you have an interviewer who goes to the respondent, and you have survey which you actually kind of administer with them. And there are different sampling methodologies also which play a critical role depending on what the kind of objective is, right? You could have sampling which is purposive, and you could have sampling which is random, and I'll also come to that in a bit in terms of what do we mean by that. The representation is also very key, right? Now, representation, I mean to say, the key demographics that are very critical. Now, for example, you want to understand Gen Z, or you want to understand just among married people certain behaviors, or you want to just target affluent people, or you want to just understand Emiratis for that matter, right? So depending on the research objectives, you need to make sure that you have enough representation of the key demographics that are critical to understand, followed by the research instrument, which is the questionnaire or the discussion guide itself, which is really critical to build upon. And it should not be something which is like, kind of piecemeal, right? That you have one question asked here, you have one question asked there, but it should be more of like a story, more of like a discussion, which you're having with the consumer. At the end of it, market research is more about understanding people. It's more about a discussion to understand why they do certain things. And a questionnaire also should kind of really reflect reflect that in the discussion kind of a format. And obviously, it should not be so long enough that people eventually get bored and they say yes for everything, right? So you need to make sure that your questionnaire length is kind of optimal. You have questionnaire which is designed smartly to make sure you get the right responses. So talking about context, right? So if I were to ask you the awareness of, say, different brands of mobile phones from the context of only mobile phones, I would probably have a higher level of awareness, consideration, usage, etc. for an Apple. But when I change the context to include mobile phones and DSLRs, if it is from a photography perspective, say for example, I want to understand camera users, right? So camera users could be only mobile or they could be mobiles and DSLRs. So once I change the context, my data changes. So it's very important to establish that context at the upfront because that really defines how you analyze the data and how you report your findings. Sample size, like I spoke about, is again very critical, right? Because the sample size is a reflection of the consumer you will target eventually. And you need to make sure that you have enough sample size so that you have confidence when you're presenting the data to the client that, this sample size is robust enough to be able to take a decision upon. And this kind of gives you an idea of basically, depending on the sample size, what is the margin of error? At the end of it, a survey is trying to replicate your consumers in the market, right? Now, you could have a survey which is like you have a typical census survey, which governments do to really understand, how many people reside and how many things they have in their household, etc. That requires a massive sample size to make sure that you're as accurate as possible in terms of understanding your population. But when it comes to, say, for example, understanding your product performance, you would rather not go to a very high sample. You would rather say I would go for a 200 or a 300 or a 500 sample size. But obviously that comes with a margin of error, right? So a margin of error is nothing but saying that, say 50% of, say for example, in a survey, you get to understand of 500 people that 50% of people say they're satisfied with a specific product. What margin of error typically tells you is that satisfaction would actually vary between, over here, if you see the margin of error is roughly around 5%, right? So what a margin of error tells you is that satisfaction would vary between 45% to 55%, roughly, if I put it that way. So that is the importance of a sample size when it comes to designing a survey. Then we spoke about the methodology, right? Methodology is again dependent on the category that you're looking at or the key task that you're trying to address. Now, say for example, you want to understand the metro users, then your methodology of targeting metro users would be that you would rather kind of segregate. So if you look at metro, you have metro kind of divided into different lines, as in depending. So in UAE, if I would take it that way, you have a red line and a green line, and you would basically divide your sample among commuters on the red line and the blue line, on the green line, and you would kind of really understand from their perspective whatever you're trying to understand. Or you want to understand petrol users or petrol buyers, then you would definitely have a more purposive sample where you would stand outside the petrol station and you talk to everybody who kind of goes and fills the petrol over there to understand certain behaviors or perceptions, etc., about different brands of petrol. Or for that matter, you want to understand the brand buyers, then you would specifically go and target those brand buyers to understand them better. So depending on the category and the task, your methodology kind of changes and you need to adapt accordingly. Representation, like I said, is also very key, right? Now, we spoke about, say, for example, companies want to target Emiratis or Gen Z, etc., right? So you would want to make sure that you represent the key demographics which are critical for the client or for the company that you are doing the research for. And this is just to give you an example over here. This is an article from McKinsey & Company wherein they try to understand, the behaviors of, baby boomers, Gen Z, Gen X, Gen Y. And there are clear differences when it comes to these generations over here, and depending on at what stage your brand is or what your target consumer is, you would want to make sure that you are able to capture the nuances across these consumer segments to be able to understand your consumer segment better. And the research instrument itself is absolutely critical, right? Now think of it this way, and I'll show you an example also over here, but think of it this way, right? So say, for example, you want to understand two things. You want to understand, one, how is my brand perceived in the market from a consumer perspective? Do people trust me? Do people think I'm modern? Do people think I'm innovative? Do people think I'm worth paying that brand that amount for? Uh, and the company also wants to understand, what really triggered people to buy my specific brand. Now, there could be two ways of asking these questions, right? So one way is that, I could start with asking, what triggered you to buy the brand? And then you could follow up with a question on, okay, what do you perceive of different brands to be with respect to, say, trust, value for money, etc. The other way could be that you start with asking the perceptions which people have about brands, and then you could follow up with a question on basically, why did you buy my brand? The second approach is a better approach because you're not kind of biasing people to think in a certain direction. The first approach is kind of, leading, and you kind of bias the people to think in a negative way or in a positive way towards a specific brand. And then you follow with the question on perception around a brand. So obviously you already have a preconceived thought which you already kind of seeded into the consumer brain. And then you kind of are asking a question on perception, which is not right. And this over here is a TED talk by Eduardo, and I just picked up a snippet from here wherein there was an experiment which was done in terms of understanding basically what sort of puzzles do children pick when it comes to an experiment that they conducted.
Research clearly shows these effects of mindset. In one study that Dr. Dweck did with Dr. Claudia Mueller, they had children do a set of puzzles. And then they praised the kids. To some of the kids, they said, wow, that's a really good score. You must be smart at this. That's fixed mindset praise because it portrays intelligence or abilities as a fixed quality. To other kids, they said, wow, that's a really good score. You must have tried really hard. That's growth mindset praise because it focuses on the process. Then they asked the kids, okay, what kind of puzzle would you like to do next? An easy one or a hard one? The majority of the kids who received the fixed mindset praise chose to do the easy puzzle, while the great majority of those who received the growth mindset praise chose to challenge themselves.
So as you saw over there, right, the way you ask the question really depicts on how consumers would typically answer, and hence all the more important for you to really make sure that the research instrument or the questionnaire is really thought through, and you make sure that you're not, kind of leading people to answer in a certain way that you want to. Rather, you want to capture the responses in a fashion which is not kind of, based upon how you want them to answer, And, I just have a few more slides over here, then we'll leave it to questions. So, different ways of asking basically research questions, right? So if you ask a consumer, would they buy something or not on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means not at all likely and 5 means extremely likely. Now, how would you really be able to, answer that, So, how is a 4 different from a 5, or how is a 1 different from a 2, right? So it becomes really difficult. And that's where, you have these different advanced ways or statistical ways of doing research. And this approach over here, which you see is a MaxDiff, which is called maximum difference scaling. Wherein, what you do is basically expose people to a host of products and ask them which of these would you most likely purchase and least likely purchase. And this kind of reflects in the market, right? When you're in the market to shop for products, you typically are presented with a choice of products, and it's not just one product which you make a decision upon. And in that competitive context is where you make the decision upon. And having research approaches this kind of reflect how you typically purchase or behave in the market is very important. And this approach over here is just one example where, it reflects how people make decisions in real life. And there are different ways of, enhancing a consumer understanding. Now you have surveys, you have passive metering, you have videos, you have machine learning, you've got artificial intelligence and what or not, different methods which you can do. But then, there are a host of advanced analytical methods that can help you understand things which are not stated and which are more of derived basis the consumer responses. And that's where, you have the researcher kind of really coming into picture in terms of understanding why people do certain things the way they do. So it could be to do with regression. Regression is nothing but understanding basically what are the drivers of certain behaviors of people, or for that matter, trying to understand, what is the optimum price which consumers are willing to pay for a product. Now, if I ask you what price would you be willing to pay, you would obviously say the cheapest, right? If I give you a range of options. So price sensitivity measurement kind of understands through a different technique in terms of what are the various ranges that you're willing to pay, and then give businesses a decision as to what is the optimal range, what is the optimal price point. Yeah. Then you've got migration analysis, wherein you try to understand basically, at what part of the consumer funnel do people drop out, and what is it that you can do to actually make sure that you retain them. Then you've got segmentation, you've got discrete choice modeling. Discrete choice modeling is just an advanced version of MaxTip, which I showed to you previously, wherein you try to understand basically how people will make decisions. And then you've got these various analysis, which we'll not get into, but then you've got a host of techniques which you can use. Another thing which research can help you with is, how do you become more predictive, right? And this is an example from the work we've done at MetrixLab, wherein, there were these 3 clients who really wanted to understand, what advertisement would really click with consumers. And over a course of a couple of years, what they did is basically they did a host of tests, wherein they tried to understand basically what makes consumer click, what would make sure that people stop and watch your ad, and what are the different, what would make people stop and watch your ad specifically, and do people get the message or not? And what is it that really is driving a specific creative or not? And time and again, they basically kind of, as and when they kind of started getting these learnings, they kind of implemented that in the ad that they followed after that. And as a result, we saw that the performance of the creatives that they rolled out eventually after a year kind of really improved significantly across all of these. So using research, if in case you have enough data points, you are able to definitely predict what are the key success parameters for anything to happen in the future. You're able to predict basically what would make consumers, or what would make your brand click with the consumers. Or for that matter, if you talk to influencers, or if you want to understand trends, say for example, with respect to say bartenders, or for example, shisha baristas, if you talk to the people who are actually making that product, you're able to understand the trends early on, right? For example, shisha baristas kind of mix a couple of flavors very often nowadays, and this is something they're observing on a very regular basis coming in from consumers. If you talk to these shisha baristas, they'll be able to kind of tell you basically what are those trends to catch on early on, and you can definitely go forward with a very concrete trend to the client, saying that these are the trends which are emerging, and you probably want to capture these trends. So research can help in different ways in terms of becoming predictive, and this is just one of these examples over here. Or for that matter, like we spoke about, you can even use multiple data sources to kind of integrate to tell a research story, right? Now, this is an example over here. Again, this is not something which is a live example, but this example is to give you a context of exactly how you can integrate different data sources. So this data over here is coming from one data source, wherein you have information around what is the share which a brand has in the market, or what is the price they are at, or what is the distribution they have in the market. So if you see over here, there's a new product, which is the NPD, which is the top line over here. So what you see over here is that NPD has kind of become really available quickly in the market. And what you see is through the trend over here, which is the TDP, you see, they had a line extension over here, which they had in the market, but then as soon as the new product came in the market, they switched the line extension with the new product very quickly. And this despite the fact that the new product was far more expensive as compared to the current product. And one of the possible reasons, this is again an example over here, right? And then what we looked at is we looked at the media data coming from the media agency to really understand basically what has been the share of voice. We saw that the share of voice was increasing, and the share of voice is kind of reflected in the awareness, but then there is still something which is stopping people from consuming the brand. And this came from the survey data, and the reasons came out to be that it's not available, it's not easy to find the product. So this kind of gave a very holistic understanding to the client in terms of what's really happening in the market and what's happening in terms of consumer behavior and what are the barriers for people to not purchase the product. And this is an example, and I really love this example in terms of how Starbucks really modified the strategy depending on the market, right? In Germany, what Starbucks did was when they launched in 2013, they did a neuroscience research technique, which actually suggested that consumers would be willing to pay a Starbucks they would be willing to pay a premium for Starbucks. The real world, and if you look at it in the real world today, the Starbucks actually has immense popularity in Germany, and this is despite the fact that people are paying a higher price for it. So it's not necessary that brands need to always come out with promotions to be able to get consumers to buy them. It's also a lot more about the brand itself, and all these subconscious thing, which also plays a critical role in terms of how people actually behave. And Starbucks really capitalized on this opportunity really well. In China, when Starbucks launched, they realized that China was actually a particularly tea market. And what they did is they introduced beverages that include those local tea-based ingredients. And also what Starbucks did was they initiated these partnerships with local coffee companies to better understand, what are the interfaces around the local tastes and preferences, because China as a market was very different compared to the other markets it launched into. So they really tailored this strategy depending on, which market they're entering into, and, how do they target the target consumers. Yep. That's about it, and I will leave it to questions now.
Awesome. So if you guys have any questions, please go ahead, drop it in the chat. If you want to unmute, you can do that. If you want to raise your hand, that's also fine. But while these guys are thinking about questions, let me just start with the first one. So Ashish, someone who is a recent grad or a current student and is thinking about the whole market research space, right? And they don't really know a lot about it. What are some tips that you would give to help them get started or kind of land their first job within this specific industry?
Got it. So like I mentioned earlier, Joanna, right? So market research is basically stepping into the shoes of a consumer. And for a recent graduate or for anybody out there, even for us even today, right? So what is more important is how do you think from a consumer perspective, and how you're able to kind of design your methodology, your questionnaire, your discussion guide around how consumers will think and what is critical for consumers to evaluate brands upon. So that forms the starting point. So there has to be that inquisitiveness in terms of understanding the consumers or the customers. In terms of just kind of landing a job, I think it's more about just having that curiosity, I would say, because you can study how much ever you want in terms of the techniques, the methodologies, etc. These definitely help you when you want to land a job, and there are books that can definitely aid you in basically reaching there. But then it's more about it's a mix of art and a science, I would say that way, right? So so say this. For example, look at this as an example, right? So if I show you a glass which is 50% full, you can say it's half empty or half full. So it's both art and a science, right? So you need to really be able to understand the context. You need to be able to really understand from a consumer point of view, and you should be really able to understand the category to be able to to be able to really succeed, I would say, in this kind of a field. And I think it all starts with being inquisitive about why people are doing certain things the way they are doing.
Yeah, so definitely the just being able to ask questions and observe things, and so those are some of the kind of qualities that you should have, right?
Exactly. And numbers are just as a quantitative research is all about numbers, definitely. So definitely need to have a grasp on numbers. But I have seen examples of qualitative researchers who are succeeding in quantitative, and it's just because they really understand the consumers, and it's and not so much about numbers, So
Yep.
Yeah,
definitely. Okay, that makes sense. Georgia has a question. Can you please explain the brainwave mapping technique once more?
Yeah. So the brainwave mapping technique is something like it's like an EEG, electroencephalogram, wherein you put a device on the consumer's head, and say for example you have an advertisement which is depicting humor, right? So you basically ask the consumer to watch the creative, and at the back end you have the EEG device kind of capturing how your brain is responding to each of the scenes which you're actually seeing on the screen. and it just basically kind of sees how interested you are or how disinterested you are in the specific ad. So that's how you weekly kind of put it there.
That actually sounds really interesting to watch that happen.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Vincent has a question. Is market research enough to predict what the profits of the company might be?
No, not at all, because market research is just a means of. So market research definitely is a way of. I would put it this way, right? Now, I don't know if you've heard of companies such as Interbrand, and the companies which do a lot of brand valuation kind of studies, right? So at the end of it, profit of a company is purely depicted by sales, and market research is something which is trying to understand basically the consumers, customers, and the category, and trying to mold your brand depending on these parameters which you're kind of evaluating. So market research definitely helps you understand the consumer, but not obviously the profit of the company. But what market research can help companies understand is what is that value that your company holds in the consumer mind, because at the end of it, the value of your company definitely is depicted by sales, but at the same time also it's also got subconscious equity which consumers have in the mind of which consumers have in the mind. And that's why you see a lot of these companies saying, right, that my brand is valued at so and so, or Interbrand comes up with a valuation that Apple is valued at so and so, and that's basis research wherein you try to understand what is that equity, and you kind of isolate the equity from the sales and try to understand what's that value that your brand is driving subconsciously as well.
Yeah, Vincent, I hope that kind of answers your questions. If you have any follow-up questions, you can definitely ask those.
Yeah, Vincent, I see has a question on will it be supported by brand valuation? Definitely, yes. Yeah, like I spoke about. So, you can definitely do a brand valuation for a company. There is a research which needs to be done, but at the same time, also you have a lot of financial metrics also which kind of gets built into getting the valuation for the company.
All right, I hope that answers your question, Vincent. If you guys have any other questions, please go ahead, drop it in the chat. Let me ask one more. So when people are putting out these surveys and they're trying to get responses, right? If you don't really know enough people or you don't really have a sample size, I've seen that people resort to going with SurveyMonkey or Pollfish, where they basically create the sample size for you.
Yeah.
How much do you trust that? Like, do you really think they get the exact type of person that you're looking for?
No, absolutely. That's a very valid question, Joanna. So, there are not just SurveyMonkeys or these companies out there, but there are a host of companies who, specifically for online research, you've got a host of companies who have a panel of people who they kind of engage on a regular basis, and there are extremely stringent processes and checks in place to make sure that the consumer who's answering the survey is in fact the consumer. Now, it could also happen to be, as in think of it this way, right? Now I'm on my device, I could have my wife answering the survey for me.
Yeah.
Right. So there are definitely a lot of checks and balances, and companies have kind of done a lot of background work on making sure that the responses that are captured are genuine. But obviously, you have so that is one level of check to make sure that people you're talking to are the right people.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, also once the data is collected, there are a lot of back checks also which are done to make sure that the consumers responded in a certain fashion, or say for example you have a question wherein you're trying to ask how satisfied people are with certain parameters across the product, and say somebody says 5 across all of these, right? So you have these checks and balances in place. You have skilled data processing analyst teams who are actually kind of processing the data to make sure that all these what we call as straight liners or outliers are removed from the sample, because these are somebody who probably is not even interested in filling a survey and they're just doing it for the sake of it. So you make sure that you have these checks and balances in place to make sure that the data you get is kind of actionable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Vincent's got one more question. Which one is more important, the qualitative or the quantitative?
It really depends, Vincent, and it really depends. So for example, either qualitative and quantitative could happen simultaneously, or you could have qualitative followed by quantitative, or you could have quantitative by qualitative. Now consider this as an example, right? Now say there's a company who has no understanding about the target consumer. Think of any product that you can, right? So say a company wants to launch in the market, they don't really understand the consumer, there's no research done, there's nothing available in the market. So, and I want to really understand, those nitty-gritties around the consumer. I want to understand the depth of consumer. And the depth of consumer will help me form certain hypotheses, right? I don't even have a hypothesis so to test, right? So in that case, what I would do is I would start with a qualitative study, wherein I would really understand those depths. I would form certain hypotheses which I really want to kind of validate. And once those hypotheses are built, you would do a quantitative survey to validate those. The other way around, you could do a quantitative. You could use a quantitative and a qualitative. Is say in a quantitative survey, you understood that say only 30% of consumers are happy with your product, and you've not really been able to understand that what are the reasons around why they're not happy with the product. Then you would reach out to those 30% of people, and you would try to qualitatively understand the whys around why did they answer in a certain fashion.
By the way, once we get once we are deriving on the qualitative and quantitative, it is the same result.
Sorry, I didn't get you there.
If we're gonna use the qualitative and the quantitative, both of this method, the final result is the same. Will be the
No,
same.
not at all. They are actually complementary to each other. So what quantitative would like the latter example which I gave you, right? So say for example, you understand what people do, but you don't understand why people do certain things. So qualitative would further enhance your understanding around why people are doing certain things, right? So one enhances the other. That is what I mean to say. It's not something that you will get same findings for both. But it's about just using the right mix of approaches to make sure that at the end of it, the company is able to understand what they want to, and they kind of enhance each other.
Thank you. No more questions.
Awesome, Vincent. I think that those are all the questions that we have. Thank you so much for being here, Ashish. Thank you for taking us through all of these new sort of concepts and making them very simple to understand. We really hope that you come back on another occasion and then you do another session for us. So thanks from all of us at Qureos. Thank you to each one of you guys for being here, for spending your hour with us. I hope it's been good learning for you. I will share the recording with each one of you, and I'll also send out a survey. So please go ahead and fill those out so we have some data on how to move forward. Awesome. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Hope you have a good rest of the day wherever you are joining from.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ashish.